Hi guys, so Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson clashed during Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. It got so bad that the Speaker of the House had to actually intervene once again. Now, of course, the topic was lobbying. Boris Johnson responded to Keir Starmer's questions. He didn't answer the questions, of course. He tried to distract. Now, the whole issue is quite interesting because if we look back, what happened was Boris Johnson's predecessor, David Cameron, brought in a bill against lobbying, or to make it more transparent. The Conservative Party supported it, but it didn't really go anywhere because David Cameron himself became a lobbyist. But let's hear what both of them had to say about all of this.
Mr. Speaker, he talks of the Lobbying Act. Who was it who introduced that legislation? David Cameron. Who was it who voted for the legislation? Half the Conservative front bench. We said it wouldn't be tough enough. And where did that legislation lead? 2 years later, David Cameron camping out in a Saudi desert with Lex Greensill having a cup of tea. I rest my case in relation to that legislation. Let me try another very simple question. Is the Prime Minister aware of any other government official who had commercial links with Greensill or any other lobbying role while working in government?
Mr. Speaker, or if he has any such information, he should, of course, make it.
This is a typical Boris Johnson response. If you have any information, please give it to this inquiry. The question was not, I have information. The question was, do you know of any other ministers or any other officials? Of course, Boris Johnson knows of other officials, but he has to protect them at the moment. Now, some of them will be protected, others will not. Some people will be thrown under the bus, others will not. Now, I'm afraid this entire inquiry will become a whitewash. Boris Johnson will be vindicated, senior Tories within the government will probably be vindicated, and will move on, and things will return to business as usual. This is corruption. Lobbying is corruption.
Available to Mr. Boardman. That's the point of his. That's the point of his review. It's an independent review. It'll be coming to me by June. I'm glad it will be played in the library of the House of Commons. I talk about lobbying, Mr. Speaker. He's being advised by Lord Mandelson of Global Council.
So this is another typical response. Yeah, we're doing terrible things, but what about the other side? We're corrupt, but what about the other side? Now, I'm no fan of lobbying, obviously, but there's a difference between somebody who's advising the opposition and somebody who's gaining access to the government. Like, what power does Keir Starmer have? Keir Starmer has no power over the country. So if anyone's lobbying him, I don't know whether Peter Mandelson is lobbying here in this case, but even if it was the case, what power does he have? What's the benefit of lobbying Keir Starmer? Keir Starmer is not in government. Now, when Keir Starmer is in government, there will be some questions to answer. But at the moment, I don't think there are. There's a big difference between lobbying a party that's in power and lobbying a party that's out of power. But Boris Johnson's trying to paint the picture of, well, yes, we're corrupt, but what about you? That's not resolving the problem of corruption, Boris.
Limited. Perhaps in the interests of full transparency, so we can know where he's coming from, Lord Mandelson could be encouraged to disclose his other clients, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I haven't heard a defence that ridiculous since my last days in the Crown Court. It's called the shoplifter's defence. Everyone else is nicking stuff, so why can't I? Mr. Speaker, it never worked. I remind the Prime Minister I not only prosecuted shoplifters, I prosecuted MPs over the MPs' expenses scandal, so I stand on my record. That line just isn't going to wash with me. It was a former Prime Minister, and I suspect now a former lobbyist, who once said, "This isn't a minor issue with minor consequences. Government contracts potentially worth hundreds of billions of pounds are at stake." So can the Prime Minister now answer the question the Chancellor's been ducking for weeks? How was it that Greensill Capital, a company employing David Cameron, got the green light to give hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayer-backed loans?
Mr. Speaker, whilst he was prosecuting MPs, I was cutting crime in London by 23% and cutting the murder rate by 50%. And he asked about lobbying on behalf of Greensill, Mr. Speaker. And I don't wish to embarrass the right honourable gentleman, but he doesn't have far to look. There was one person asking for the Greensill Bank to be able to use the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, and that was the Shadow Defence Secretary, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
It gets weaker and weaker. It does take me back to my defence days in the Crown Court. It's just ridiculous. The Shadow Defence Secretary. It really wasn't a good point. If you think that's a good point, you've got real problems. Shadow Defence Secretary was speaking for his constituents and for local jobs. That is million miles away from being a paid lobbyist texting friends in government. The Prime Minister says there's going to be an inquiry, but the person he's appointed worked for the same law firm which lobbied to loosen lobbying laws. You couldn't make it.
There we go. There we go. The person who's, it's like putting an arsonist in charge of the fire brigade. Somebody who wants to loosen lobbying laws, they're going to be in charge of this inquiry.
It up. What we need is to overhaul the whole broken system. This afternoon, Labour's motion calls for a proper parliamentary inquiry into this scandal. If the Prime Minister is so concerned about this, he should welcome the motion. After all, to quote David Cameron, his old school friend, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So will the Prime Minister vote with Labour today for a full, transparent, independent inquiry?
I think this is a good approach because you're putting pressure. So this is what people will remember. Look, let's have a bill. Let's vote on this in Parliament, whether we want transparency or not. And of course, Boris Johnson and his cabinet and his party will not vote for it because it's a Labour motion. As I've said this before, this is where as what James O'Brien calls footballism comes in. Labour put forward a motion that should be supported. I think if you were to ask the general public, would you support this? They would probably say yes. But the Conservatives will not support it because it's a Labour motion. Things have become so polarised that, if Keir Starmer brought in a rule to put flags on every public building, the Conservative Party would vote against it because it's a Labour motion. But let's hear how Boris Johnson responded to that.
Mr. Speaker, I think he would have been better off supporting the Lobbying Act, and the Labour Party would have been better off not campaigning to get rid of it. It toughens up our laws.
It toughens up our laws. Where you had this entire disaster is because lobbying laws were not tough enough. And Boris Johnson is saying, yes, we're having this disaster because we've had tough lobbying laws. What?
And, Mr. Speaker, I think that his own proposal is simply to have politicians marking their own homework. What the country wants, that's all it is. A committee of MPs to look at it. It won't do a blind bit of good. That's why we're having a proper independent review. If he has any representations or allegations to make about what has taken place, he should make them to the eminent lawyer who's been asked to do it, who will be reporting to us by June.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister should be voting with us, not blocking a proper inquiry. The Greensill scandal is just the tip of the iceberg. Dodgy contracts, privileged access, jobs for their mates. This is the return of Tory Sleaze. Mr. Speaker, it's now so ingrained in this Conservative government. We don't need another Conservative Party appointee marking their own homework. Actually, Mr. Speaker, the more I listen to the Prime Minister, the more I think that Ted Hastings and AC12 are needed to get to the bottom of this one. Mr. Speaker, we know the Prime Minister will not act against Sleaze, but this House can. So can I urge all members of this House to come together this afternoon to back Labour's motion and start to clean up the sleaze and cronyism that's at the heart of this Conservative government.
And once again, this is a powerful move, pointing to members of Parliament, like the government won't do anything about it, the party on the other side won't do anything about it, but maybe individual MPs can support this. Unfortunately, they will not. They don't care about this. They vote according to party lines. Boris Johnson will tell them, the party itself will tell them how to vote, and they will vote against any such bill. But it is interesting to raise this, so when a motion is brought forward, you can highlight the Tory MPs, and I will do it in the future, the Tory MPs who voted against this. Tory MPs who will say, we're against corruption, but we're not going to vote for this bill or this motion that will deal with corruption.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that's why we're putting in an independent review. That's why we have tougher laws on lobbying. A great shame that Labour opposed them. Mr. Speaker, yes, we are getting on with rooting out bent coppers, Mr. Speaker. We're also appointing and hiring thousands more police officers.
What has this got to do? Back into his rant once again, his grandstanding. Start talking about something that's unrelated to the principal topic here.
We're fighting crime. We're fighting crime on the streets of our cities, whilst they opposed the police and crime bill, which would have put in tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offenders. Absolutely. And they then encouraged people who went out and demonstrated, Mr. Speaker, to kill the bill.
They did not do that, and Boris Johnson was called out a number of times before about this. He's lying once again. See, here's the problem. Boris Johnson can lie in Parliament. And then Boris Johnson is talking about setting up a commission to deal with lobbying. What is the point of having a commission or an inquiry into lobbying if Boris Johnson himself is capable of lying in Parliament? What is the point of that?
We're getting on with protecting the public. That's absolutely correct, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with protecting the public of this country from crime of all kinds. We're getting on with the job of running this country, of rolling out a vaccination programme.
The vaccination programme. This is Boris Johnson's fallback. It used to be Brexit. We're getting Brexit done. That was Boris Johnson's response to everything. Like, why aren't there enough nurses being hired for the NHS? We're going to get Brexit done, and that's going to fix that problem. Okay, there's crime on the streets. Don't worry, once we get Brexit done, we'll fix that problem. Now it's the vaccine. We're getting the vaccine rolled out. No, it's not you that's getting it rolled out. It's the NHS. Isn't it convenient that you never talk about the NHS rolling out the vaccine, but you talk about how we are rolling it out? And when he means we, he means the government. If the government had decided to give the rollout of the vaccine to Circle, their friends in Circle, it would have been an absolute disaster. Fortunately, it wasn't a disaster because it was run by the NHS itself. Imagine if Test, Trace and Isolate had been rolled out by the NHS and not a private company.
Order. Prime Minister, I think we ought to at least try and address the question. Dean Russell.
So finally, the Speaker of the House intervenes and says, you need to answer the questions. But this is the end of Keir Starmer's questions. So it's the typical point where Boris Johnson stands up and grandstands and talks about something that's unrelated. It's his opportunity in his eyes to shine. Now I can, punch the Labour Party in the nose. I can get away with talking absolute twaddle because there's no comeback. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you thought about all of this. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. You ensure that this channel continues to exist. I'm eternally grateful for all of your support. If you join Patreon, you will receive instant access to our Discord server, where we have both audio and video chats. You can chat with me and other patrons, where we discuss important and non-important issues. Becoming a patron per month costs about the same as a large coffee, so why not check it out?